project on basically everything that exists. Our Cloud City development doing Rails consulting. I'm here to talk to you about how security is hard. And unfortunately, going shopping is not an option. So, to start things off, let's talk about Ruby itself. Like, I don't know how long all of you guys have been a Rubyist, but Ruby security issues historically happen, I don't know, like maybe once, twice a year, something like that. Ruby has not regularly had major security issues crop up on a regular basis. The last few months, that has not really been the case. We've had 327 and 385 and 392, and they've all had major security issues. This is really not normal. That's like since November, so we're talking 6 months with 3 releases. That's like, 18 months or 2 years worth of normal releases just in the last few months. In fact, it's so not normal that the Ruby core team itself is apologizing for how frequently they're releasing. Compounding that is the fact that Rails also has security releases, and chances seem high that if you're here, you probably care about Rails security releases, it being Rails Conf and all. So Rails has also had an interesting number of security releases just since the beginning of the year. That actually, unfortunately, I could not fit the entire list of security releases that have happened so far this year onto this slide. That's not normal either. Rails has already had 13 CVE, maybe it's 12 or 13 CVE security announcements and patches since the first of this year. That's actually more than there were in the entirety of either 2012 or 2011. And we're only in the middle of April. So, right, like there's 2012 and 2011, there just weren't that many. It's like one page. So now that I've told you that Rails and Ruby have both had CVE security vulnerabilities coming out of their ears lately, this is the point at which a lot of people, as I'm having this conversation with them, stop me and say, wait, what's a CVE? I know that's like bad and security related and stuff, but I'm not sure what that means exactly. So CVEs are generally bad and related to security stuff, but it's not actually that complicated. It stands for common vulnerabilities and exposures, but when you get down to it, CVEs are actually just a number that is assigned by a company called MITRE, and lots of groups, corporations, governments, that sort of thing, have all agreed to use CVE numbers issued by MITRE as their single coordinated point of reference for security issues. So MITRE assigns blocks of CVE numbers to companies that are on the list of numbering authorities. That includes mostly big software companies, Apple, Adobe, Cisco, Red Hat, Microsoft. And each of those companies then, as they work with software that they either develop themselves or that they use frequently, assigns numbers out of the block that they've been given to new security issues that crop up. The Ruby community has mostly been assisted in this by Red Hat. Red Hat has an open source security task force, and the main interface point between Red Hat and the Ruby community has been Carl Seyfried, and he has kind of provided generalized Rubyists with advice and CVEs out of Red Hat's block of open source CVEs when we've had issues that are a big deal. Once you have a CVE number, both MITRE and NIST, which is the government's National Institute of Standards and Technology, host websites where you can actually look at the list of all CVEs that have ever been granted and their names and what software they affect, and links to workarounds or patches or whatever it is that the vendor of that software that was affected by that vulnerability can provide. So that said, now that we know what CVEs are, Rails and Ruby communities historically have actually shared a fairly pervasive mindset of Mats is nice, and so we are nice, and we don't actually have a whole lot of problems as a result of that. Like, historically, it's been really nice. Like, you didn't have to think a whole lot about this stuff. Unfortunately, the flurry of Ruby and Rails security activity that we've seen over the last few months has kind of jump-started interest by security researchers in Ruby. Oh, hey, that's a lot of security vulnerabilities in a very small amount of time. I wonder if that means that I can find more security vulnerabilities if they're that easy to find. And that means that suddenly the entire Ruby community is under increasingly close scrutiny by people who actually find problems with programming languages and implementations as their jobs, or just as their very intense hobbies. So fortunately, so far, all of the super significant security vulnerabilities that I just talked about in Ruby and Rails have come from security researchers who are on the white, or at least white-ish side of the white hat, black hat divide. And that's meant that we've actually been able to provide fixes for all of those huge issues simultaneous with public announcement of those issues. A lot of times that doesn't happen. We've been really, really lucky. The fact that we have been really, really lucky does not mean that that's going to keep happening. And that's why I think it's really important to start talking about this stuff right now as security researchers are starting to hone in on us and before we've been not lucky. So moving on from minaswan, DHH is not as nice as Mats, as you may have noticed. And while that's true, we can absolutely learn from Rails and DHH and how they have had to deal with security vulnerabilities. And historically, Rails has actually contained somewhere between 80 and 100% of the security issues that the entire Ruby community has ever had to deal with. That's because historically, Rails was the entire attack surface of the Ruby programming language to the internet. If you had a problem that wasn't with Rails, there wasn't anything to attack, and if you had a problem with Rails, you could attack basically everything that was Ruby at that point. So what that means is that the Rails security team actually has had to develop through trial and error and oh shit, a lot of the processes that I'm going to try and explain and then tell you how you can apply to your own development procedures. So something really cool happened with Rails over the last, I don't know, year or so. We now have gems for basically everything, right? Rails 3, it was the great modularization of Rails. It's no longer this gigantic monolithic beast. You can pick and choose what stuff you actually want to use. You can swap out some things for other things. It's really cool. Bundler launched around the same time. Bundler gives you the ability to plug in any fork from GitHub in one line of code, and suddenly you're running a variant of the released and well-known code that may or may not have security issues with it. So the thing is, having so many gems means that now there are dozens, or possibly, depending on your application, hundreds of gems that could all individually provide security vulnerabilities to your application. So in the first 8 weeks of this year, for example, right, you're probably thinking, oh, I don't use hundreds of gems. I don't actually have that many security vulnerability, possibilities. Well, in the first 8 weeks of this year, there were security vulnerabilities fixed in releases of Ruby gems, Bundler, JSON, RexML, Rack, ARL, Active Record, Action Pack, Active Support, and RDoc. Yes, it's a static documentation generator. It had an XSS bug. So even if you think, oh, I just used the standard library, I don't use any of that Rails crap, you probably still had something that was on that list. And that's really problematic. Like, what do we do when everything that we could possibly use is having to deal with security issues simultaneously? It's really hard. Updating is a huge pain. Updating distracts you from feature development. Updating is hard to sell to your boss or manager who has deadlines that they want to meet with things that actually deliver quote-unquote business value. Here is the thing about handling security updates. Handling security updates is insurance. Your boss doesn't say, oh, we would have 2 weeks more runway if we didn't pay for insurance on our office. If your office burned down with whatever in it, it would be pretty catastrophic. And as a result of the small risk combined with the small chance combined with very large risk, it's worth it to invest that small amount of insurance in case something really catastrophic were to happen. Security updates are the same as insurance. It's basically security exploitation insurance. It's a small cost. It greatly mitigates the risk of being exploited by a security vulnerability. There's a famous, well, maybe famous is the wrong word, but there's a commonly retold security anecdote about how secure it is that you have to be. It's a lot like running away from a bear. You don't actually have to be faster than the bear, you only have to be faster than the guy who's running behind you. And the thing is, if you can apply security patches before somebody else does, chances are good that it's somebody else that'll have to deal with the consequences of not having patched, because you become a higher effort target and therefore lower down on the list. Without updates, failures can be super catastrophic. Just cleaning up from a single security breach, as you may have even noticed from the recent rubygems.org security breach, it's entirely possible that a big enough security breach means that your entire web app thing will just not be online for as long as it takes you to figure out what actually happened. It's kind of an impossible to estimate amount of man-hours, effort, lawyers, figuring out what your legal obligations are, and of course, lots and lots of time and lost customer goodwill because you have to tell them what happened and explain that you're never going to let that happen again, you hope. Even worse than that is disclosure laws. This is not super well known, but when security vulnerabilities happen, lots of states now have laws that require the company that previously was the only place where that information was stored to actively inform every single person whose information, as far as you can tell, was potentially compromised. And that might just mean sending every single one of them an email, but depending on the exact legal situation of your company, the states that your customers are in, and a bunch of other stuff that I'm not really an expert on, there are potential civil penalties and there are even potential criminal penalties if you don't get this right. You really don't want to have to deal with any of this. Just invest the time to do the updates as the patches come out, and all of this stuff basically goes away, right? It increases the chances that you'll have to deal with all this stuff from small to very, very, very small. So kind of in conclusion, updating, yes, I understand updating is really hard work and it's not fun and it's not cool and you don't get to go give talks at conferences about how you awesomely updated your Rails app from 3.2.12 to 3.2.13. But it's totally worth it. If you actually do those updates, the chance that you're going to have to deal with all of those security incidents and all of the hanging on repercussions from that means that once you have updated, you should be able to go home and sleep pretty well at night afterwards. Right. So now you, as a developer, you probably use other people's code. Chances seem high, if you're at RailsConf. So I'd also like to talk to you about reporting security issues. Kind of right along with the fact that Ruby and Rails hasn't had to deal with security issues before means that Ruby and Rails don't have kind of cultural, I don't even know what to call that, like the Ruby hive mind doesn't know what to do with security issues yet. So great, you update your stuff, you pay attention to security announcements, You install new versions of gems when they come out, but you use Rails yourself, and one day you find out that some gem that you use out of the 250 in your gem file has a bug. And for a lot of people, their first instinct when they find a bug is just to run off to GitHub and say, hey, your thing doesn't work, and there's a public issue. Please stop and think for a second before you do that. There are a lot of reasons why. Let me try and cover the most critical ones. So security research in general as a field over the last several decades of computer software has developed a kind of well-known policy or plan for how to deal with security-related bugs specifically. And that is called responsible disclosure. And I'm going to break that down for you and explain exactly how it works. So responsible disclosure is definitely the worst possible situation, except for all of the other situations which are even worse. Nobody's, right? So it's the best situation that we have so far, and you can kind of tell that because everyone involved in the responsible disclosure process ends up unhappy about it. But on the upside, hopefully, no one involved in the responsible disclosure process ends up screwed by it either, and that's why it's the best thing that we have so far. So the first part of responsible disclosure is disclosing things, and companies really hate that because, as it turns out, if you can keep quiet that you lost 10 million of your customers' credit cards, nothing bad happens. So companies just don't like letting people know that they screwed up, right? It has bad effects all over the place. The other side of responsible disclosure is being responsible, and really clever people who just figured out how to get, I don't know, take your pick, everyone's usernames and passwords out of your website or some other company's website are really excited about it. And they want to tell everyone how awesome they are and how clever they are and how, I don't know, whatever. They get street cred. So the responsible part means that the person who found the problem goes and talks to the company, and instead of going public with it, says, hey, you should fix this before other people find out about it and something actually bad happens. Security researchers pretty much, they're not, usually they agree to this because by agreeing to it, it means that the company more or less has no effective legal case against them, whereas if they are willing to go and publicize whatever it is that they hacked out of the company actually has a fairly good chance of being able to somewhere between sue them and throw them in jail, depending on how bad it was. So having arrived at the situation that nobody really likes, there are some companies that are trying to make it more palatable in the form of rewards for security researchers. So this may, although it's not universally adopted, actually make the situation slightly less bad. Maybe everyone can end up happy, maybe. So for example, let's take Facebook. Facebook actually has a large responsible disclosure page where they say, hey, we actually have a whole policy about how you disclose things to us and what criteria you include, how to reproduce it, and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, if you do follow Facebook's disclosure policy and you did actually find a security bug, there's a $500 minimum reward for every single thing that you tell Facebook about. There is no maximum to that reward. If you find a really big bug in Facebook, you might get a whole pile of money. Somewhere kind of in between is GitHub. GitHub also has a responsible disclosure policy. They're really big fans of being nice about it, and they have had to deal with the entire range of people disclosing problems with GitHub, from not mentioning anything except actually activating the hack against the website, all the way up through, we did actually find something and here's how to fix it. GitHub is really excited to make you happy about having reported to them, and they guarantee that you'll get a t-shirt. But they also don't have a stated policy for dollar rewards, and they are potentially willing to compensate people who find things that they think are worth rewarding. All the way on the other end of the spectrum, we have Engine Yard. Engine Yard also has a responsible disclosure policy. They ask that people report things carefully and responsibly, but they also very clearly state on their webpage that they don't reward people ever. You might get a t-shirt, but even that's not guaranteed. That's the entire spectrum of possible responses to security researchers. Historically, explicitly stating that you don't want to reward people has usually produced security researchers that are more interested in selling what they found to bad guys than to good guys. Bad guys are frequently willing to pay money for security exploits against well-known and exploitable companies. I don't know what the line of reasoning is behind companies like Engine Yard that refuse to offer a reward, but it seems like it creates a situation with bad incentives. So anyway, now that you know all about that, back to you. We were talking about finding bugs in other people's code. So congratulations, you found a bug. Good job. Like, honestly, that's how software gets better, right? Like, you find things that are wrong and you help people fix them, and everybody benefits as a result. Like, Rails is a perfect example of how awesome that system is. But before you go running off to the GitHub issue tracker or wherever it is that you're going, please, 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 please stop and ask yourself 2 questions about the thing that you just found. Sit down, figure out exactly what the constraints are on the bug that you found. You need to, be able to report it in a way that's clear enough that they can figure out how to reproduce it and how to stop it from happening. But here are the 2 questions. Can you access something that you, as the owner of an account on that website, should not be able to access? Does the bug mean that you can suddenly see my credit card number, for example? The second question is, can you disable something for someone else, right? If the bug is, oh, I can completely break this website for myself, that's really actually quite good to report, but if the answer to that is, if I load this into my web browser and hit refresh 10 times in 60 seconds, the entire website stops responding to anyone who tries to make a request to it, chances are pretty good that that's actually a security issue, right? You have just discovered a denial of service attack against whatever it is that you just found the bug in. So if the answer was yes to either one of those questions, can I access something I shouldn't? Or can I disable whatever I'm interacting with for other people besides just me? Please, 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 please disclose whatever it is that you just found responsibly. Do not paste the output from your command into a GitHub issue that you post publicly. Contact the author of whatever the software is. Like, you may have to figure out which particular library has the bug as you're working against your own application. It's totally worth figuring out exactly which library so that you can talk to the person who wrote it. Reporting to the security team means that patches can be written, they can be tested, you can be sure that the problem is fixed, and by the time it's announced publicly, there can actually be a fix available. This is really important, especially the bigger the project is, the more important this is. Like, if you actually find a bug in Rails, it's really, really important that they be able to have a patch by the time your problem is public. And this is actually something that the Rails security team deals with tirelessly, and in my opinion, very impressively, is that lots of people who use Rails say, oh, I found a bug, I'm just gonna go file this in the GitHub issue tracker that, oh, by the way, if you do this thing, the entire Rails application explodes and never responds correctly again. And it's great that they're reporting, but Rails puts a lot of effort into making sure that they have security-specific infrastructure set up so that they can fix this kind of stuff before it becomes a public danger to everyone running a Rails app. So if you're going to contact the author, here's kind of like in descending order of helpfulness what to look for. Try to see if the project has a security policy in general, right? Rails is really good about this. They have a security page. They have a security, like, private mailing list that goes just to the security team. It doesn't even go to the entire core team. Everybody on the security team is super good at all of this stuff, and they are topically security experts. If you can't find a web page for the project and a security address or contact information, at very least, there will be an email address in the gemspec. It's built into every gem. It's maybe not obvious, but if you dig into that gem in the gemspec, the person who wrote it, there should be at least one email address that you can use to try and contact the author of the library. Absolute worst case, I've had to do this a couple times myself, go find the repo on GitHub. Most GitHub profiles have an email address. That's kind of like a last ditch, please, yeah. If you're doing this, there's a whole range of things that could possibly go wrong. I've witnessed everything from I can't actually figure out who the relevant person to contact about this code is, all the way up through someone who's a maintainer on this library already committed a fix, but the only person who can push to Ruby gems is out of the country with no internet access. What do I do? Please work together with the people who author the code that you found the problem with. Please have empathy for them. They are also people. They also probably have day jobs doing something completely unrelated to whatever the security vulnerability is in. Please try to recognize that they may not be able to get back to you instantaneously, and that they also care about making things safe and better for everybody. Now that we've kind of covered that, like, if you are working with the person, there's actually a whole lot you can do that will help make the path easier and will make everybody happy as quickly as possible. If you do hear back from an author, definitely try to work with them. You can offer to even work with them or just fix the security bug yourself if it actually is critical for you to have it fixed. Most authors, most of the time, are just really excited that you're willing to work with them instead of yelling at them about how they're a horrible person for having written this horrible bug that means that your application is horribly vulnerable. Security researchers are frequently not very nice of people, and if you are nice of a person, chances are pretty high that it'll go better. Having said all of that, once you have a fix, try to make sure that the fix and the announcement of the vulnerability make it out at least at the same time, and if possible, release the fix slightly ahead of the announcement of the vulnerability. Definitely don't publicize it. Even if there is a fix, don't go writing up on your blog or public GitHub about how the vulnerability was a big deal just because someone figured out how to solve it if it hasn't actually made it into the next version of the gem yet. If all of that completely fails to work and you just can't find anyone who could possibly work with you to get the fix into what is publicly available, really you should just sit down and fix it yourself because you're already using that thing, and if you have a security problem that's a result of that thing, fixing it's a great thing to do. You can easily fork that, say I have fixed this, and you start using it via bundler, and if that library is abandoned, chances are pretty good that other people will need the fix as well. Definitely only do that if the responsible party has completely vanished, but it's a pretty good last-ditch option. So, finally, and this is also pretty important, what about your gems, right? Presumably everybody here is a Rubyist. How many of you guys have ever written a gem or a library of your own? Raise of hands. That's most of you, I think. Okay, so Rubyists like writing libraries. It's really easy. They're very helpful. Bundler makes it really easy to pull them together and share them between projects. Tons of people have projects of their own, and every single one of your projects is a security vulnerability in someone else's application waiting to happen. So basically what I'd like to do at the end here is kind of run through how to be on the other side of responsible disclosure. How do you responsibly receive a report of a security issue and find out that you have a bug from someone who's hopefully being helpful, and how do you help everyone who's using your library already? So unless your code is perfect and you want to buy this real estate in Florida that I'm selling, chances are good that you may eventually have to face this scenario. So I'm hoping that this will help at least some gem developers avoid having to painfully relearn the lessons that the security community and that the Rails security team has already had to learn once by trial and error. So let's cover the possible scenarios when your gem has a bug in it. First is the easy scenario, right? Hopefully, another Ruby developer just says in an email or whatever to you, hey, I found this thing. It seems kind of like a problem. Do you think maybe we could work together to fix it? Awesome, you can actually do that. Work with them, fix it, review the fix, release the fix, announce that there was a security issue. Definitely try and publicize via the regular kind of security-esque channels, especially if your library happens to be widely used. Tell the people who use your thing that there's an important update and that they should update. Next hardest problem, there's a problem, but it's already out there and people know about it. This is the totally awesome scenario when someone sends you an email and says, oh, hey, did you know that there's already a Metasploit recipe against your library? And you go, oh, great, thanks. And then start thinking about heading for a foreign country or whatever it is that seems like a good idea at the time. If you run into this scenario, it's worth sitting down and figuring out whether you can actually announce it right away. Because if there's already a vulnerability with an exploit, that means that the bad guys know about it, but the good guys might not. And at that point, giving the announcement and saying, hey, this is a problem you should probably know about if you use this thing, is very frequently a really good idea and very helpful. If it's in the wild, maybe worth saying, hey, I need to prioritize fixing this right away so that the fix can get out and people can stop having problems. Prioritizing that really highly can be super worthwhile. Once you have that, release the fix, hopefully work with the person who reported it eventually and or the automated attack against it to make sure that the fix is actually fixing things, and then get the fix and the announcement of the vulnerability out to everybody. My suggestion for a rule of thumb about announcing it is if additional publicity won't significantly increase the damage, try to make people aware of it as quickly as possible, and then try to fix it as quickly as possible. Last is the hard case, which is a security researcher who has heard about Ruby and how it is a land of security plenty and how you can find remote shell vulnerabilities just hanging out, obviously, for you to take. If you get an email from a security researcher like this, respond right away. Set their expectations, be very clear, update them regularly. Say, I am working on this. Say, I'm still working on this. Say, I'm still working on this. I am here, I am aware of the problem. Don't tell people about this yet. Security researchers who are really hardcore will be perfectly happy to go public with whatever problem they've found if you didn't reply to them again for 2 days. If you have a really big problem, this is one of the lessons that Rails core and Rails security team learned the hard way. Be very clear with them about what you're doing about it. Finally, as a gem author, make it as easy as possible for people to approach you about this stuff. Definitely make sure that your gem specs have your email address in them. Make sure that your GitHub profile has your email in it. If you're on a team that works on a specific library, make sure that there's a security address that goes to whatever portion of the team is relevant. Get a PGP key for that team. Write, even if it's just a paragraph in the README, get a disclosure policy so that people can find how to talk to you about it.
Finally, as part of the greater Ruby ecosystem of security, I have created a mailing list for announcing entire Ruby ecosystem security releases and only security releases, so it's extremely low traffic, but Rails security release announcements go there, Ruby Gem security release announcements should go there, Ruby security release announcements should go there. It's a Google group. I set up a short link to it. And hopefully, once we're following all of the hard-learned lessons of the security community, we can all just chill out, and that's when we can go shopping. All right, you guys have any questions? We don't have time for questions, so thanks a lot.